Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 4th annual Day of Empathy here in Michigan. The Day of Empathy is an annual event raising up the voices of people impacted by our criminal justice system. Everyone at Safe and Just Michigan is thrilled you are participating. We have muted your microphones to ensure that everyone can hear the panel, but you can ask questions using the chat function on Zoom. At the end of every panel, we will answer questions for as long as time allows. We want to thank each of our co-sponsors for helping us to get the news out about this event and from when we changed it from an in-person to a virtual event. Our national partner, Cut 50, AFSC Michigan Criminal Justice Program, ARROW, Citizens for Prison Reform, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, Michigan Center for Youth Justice, Michigan Faith in Action, Nation Outside, Still Standing, the University of Michigan Carceral State Project, the University of Michigan Prison Creative Arts Project. For those of you who want to revisit this discussion, we are streaming the event on Safe and Just Michigan's Facebook page through Facebook Live, and you can engage with other people all across the country all day by engaging with the hashtags Day of Empathy and Empathy365. Troy?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Troy Reenstra. I'm Outreach Director with Safe and Just Michigan, and I will be the host and moderator of the Clean Slate panel this morning for Day of Empathy. Before we begin, I believe it's important to note that there are people who are isolated in jails and in prisons, institutions, and detention centers. They're isolated in their homes and hospitals. And then there are those who suffered loss as a result of COVID-19 and those who have suffered as a result of the actions of others. It's important that for the Day of Empathy, we acknowledge these things and we give a moment to just reflect on that as we begin. On the panel this morning, we have John Cooper. John Cooper is the Executive Director of Safe and Just Michigan. He's responsible for the organization's strategic vision and direction. John joined Safe and Just Michigan in 2017 as Policy Director after serving as a Criminal Justice Policy Advisor to the State Representative David LeGrand, Democrat out of 75th District in Michigan for Grand Rapids. Prior to his time working for Representative LeGrand, John spent 7 years as a legislator in Washington, D.C. We also have Hakeem Nathanael Crampton. Hakeem is a native to Michigan who was raised between Lansing and Jackson, Michigan, where he currently lives and works. Mr. Crampton is the founder, director, and academic mentor in education of network Amen for Youth, LLC. He's an author of 6 English language arts textbooks and 1 poetry book, My Linguistics. He's also the Michigan statewide organizer for Just Leadership USA, a former housing case manager for Community Action Agency at Jackson Housing Commission, and a 2019 appointee of Governor Gretchen Whitmer as commissioner to the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission. And lastly, we have Jason Smith. And Jason is a leader at MCYJ, which is Michigan Center for Youth Justice. He's their legislative advocacy. He leads legislative advocacy efforts and is responsible for managing several of MCYJ's projects that aim to reduce the use of out-of-home placement through the statewide expansion of effective community-based programming for justice-involved youth. In the past, Jason served as coordinator of the advocacy campaign to raise the age juvenile jurisdiction in Michigan to the age of 18. There. So we have our panelists, and I will present our panelists with a few questions. We'll be having a discussion for 30 minutes, and then afterward, you'll be able to post your questions in the chat box. So we should probably start by addressing the crisis that moved this event into a virtual event. So as I aforementioned, here we are in the midst of COVID-19, has us all isolated. John, where in terms would you say the state responsiveness to COVID-19 and what's being done and what still needs to be done as it is to Clean Slate and how we execute our work? And finally, what can people here do to move the agenda forward?
Hey, that's great questions, Troy. And thank you, Troy and Josh, for the introduction and for all the hard work in setting this up. we have gotten a ton of questions from people across the state about what is happening from an advocacy standpoint with our decision makers who control the jails and prisons and courts and law enforcement agencies. I understand there is a lot of concern about the safety of people who are in the system and what precautions are being taken, what responses are underway, and how we as advocates are pushing for best practices from our state and local law enforcement agencies. So first of all, I want you guys to know that for the last 2 weeks, we have been communicating with our governor's office, Department of Corrections, the administrators for county jails, county sheriffs, and also we've signed on to letters to national decision makers as well, like the National Governors Association, National Sheriff's Association, National Conference of Mayors. There has been a huge mobilization of advocates to inform decision makers, and I think it's important for the public to know that, because I think first and foremost, folks are wanting to know what has gotten into the hands of decision makers. And I just want to assure people that, we and other advocates have been pushing and will continue to push for limited arrests, limited court proceedings, releases from jails and prisons. And the good news is that there have been some positive responses from decision makers in the state. So first of all, the courts have been shut down to only essential functions and gatherings of no more than 10 people. That order came down a week ago already. The Department of Corrections has been relatively proactive. They've been on lockdown for 2 weeks already. That hasn't prevented initial cases among staff at one facility and among the prisoner population at another from happening. But we're getting almost daily updates from the Department of Corrections on the way they're handling those situations. And we know they're trying to be proactive and responsive. As we hear more about what's happening inside the prisons, we're going to try and push that information out to the broader public. We're going to put together a blog post with resources and information for folks that hopefully will go up later today or tomorrow, and we're going to update that periodically as the situation develops. With respect to the county jails, there's been good progress in a couple counties we know. The daily population in Wayne County is down over 200 from what it was the other week. There are over 100 releases that have been directly related to precautions on COVID-19. We know that Ingham County jail, they've been working to reduce population there as well. We're going to try and collect information from other jails across the state, but because those are county institutions, that information is harder to come by. But follow us on social and we'll try and keep you updated.
Okay, I'm free. Thanks, John. So Hakeem, if you would just talk a little bit about some of your worries and concerns about how COVID-19 is affecting people in jail and prisons today, not only here in Michigan, but across the country. We know that you're with the national organization, Just Leadership USA, but what concerns, worries, and what work is Nation Outside, whom you're a member of, and Just Leadership USA doing to address some of these concerns?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me on. I think right offhand, what comes to mind with some of the most urgent concerns we're seeing and we're having regarding COVID-19 and individuals that are currently in jail is recently, as you know, and which is going to be discussed, there was a recent Jails and Task Force committee that went across the state and went and learned much about what is happening inside jails. And I think that's key right now during COVID-19 is for us to bring to the forefront what is really happening inside jails. How are people's living arrangements and what are the conditions of confinement while people are in jail? So right now, that's a very urgent concern of ours. There's a vast number of people that are in pretrial detention, have not been convicted of any crime. Most of them unable to just make bail. Of course, there are some people under violent offenses and some people not, but it's an urgent concern of ours. And so we're drafting right now through Just Leadership USA some statements, some recommendations to the state of Michigan that would directly address some of the conditions of confinement and how our people, or we should say, how are the internal administration of county jails and other correctional facilities, how are they maintaining a policy? What are they developing a policy, a strategy to really address the concerns and issues of people that are currently incarcerated, particularly those that are in pretrial detention, as well as those that are ailing, failing in health, and older? And what about those that are in fact already set to be released, perhaps in the next 6 months, the next year, or the next 2 weeks? People are set to be released from prison all the time. How are they being received? What services and resources do we have available in our community to actually provide a real support service for them when they come home, a transition system, so that when they come home, they are able to come home and successfully avoid catching COVID-19, are able to have the essentials that they need to transition into housing? And perhaps, what about employment? Right now, most jobs are shut down. So if we do release people from jails and our recommendations are followed, what are we doing to actually ensure that people are prepared and well received upon being released from jail? So those are the discussions that we're having right now, and so those are the kind of things that we're really working on and hoping to really get some concrete solutions to in the very near future.
I agree. Thank you, Hakeem. Jason, so let's talk about some of the most vulnerable people in our community, the kids. Not only do you work with kids and work to have them released from prison, young people who are sentenced as juveniles, but we also have young kids who are living in detention centers right now. And we know that young people can contract COVID-19. So what are your concerns and what work are you doing around this issue? If you would talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So just like John and Hakeem mentioned, on the adult side, for kids, the absolute best response to COVID-19 is to release as many young people as possible from detentions and residential placements and send them back home to their families and halt any kind of new admissions. Just like jails and prisons and college dorms or other communal living situations, youth facilities are environments where viruses can spread quickly. And like you said, Troy, there are a lot of young people that are vulnerable to this illness if they have a pre-existing condition like asthma or diabetes or an issue that could be exacerbated by COVID-19. And we're really concerned that while they're confined, a lot of kids aren't going to be able to practice social distancing or frequently wash their hands and prevent the illness from spreading. So, one of the consequences of reducing the risk of transmission was that facilities, just like the jails and prisons, have canceled family visits, and that can be extremely traumatic for kids. There are a lot of young people in juvenile facilities that are diagnosed with mental health disorders, and isolating children from their families with the concerns that they may be having about their parents or loved ones, grandmothers, grandfathers out in the community, and how they're dealing with this, let alone how it may impact their health and while in confinement, it can have disastrous consequences. So we're hoping that every youth in confinement can be evaluated according to their current risk level, and unless there is some substantial or immediate safety risk to others, we hope that they can be provided treatment in the community. It's something that should happen anyway, but especially now that this crisis is happening, I'm hoping that juvenile courts and juvenile justice stakeholders around the state really look at who needs to be in confinement and who doesn't. And another additional response, kind of like what John mentioned, is law enforcement. We're hoping that law enforcement will decline to arrest youth for status offenses, which are offenses specifically for youth that would not be crimes if they were adults. Truancy, curfew violations, especially with this issue of the stay-at-home order and how that might impact youth, or other low-level offenses. Just warn and release those kids, release them to their families is the best outcome we can hope for. And also, if there are young people that are starting to exhibit some symptoms of COVID-19 or other illnesses, they should be removed and placed in a medical facility. And so, just like John said about the county jails, the juvenile justice system is very decentralized. It's county managed, and every county runs their system differently. And so we only hear from a handful of stories or situations from counties that are willing to share them about what they're doing. And we have heard some good things, like, for example, Washtenaw County, where I live, reduced their youth population in their detention center by half. Several counties are using electronic monitoring to keep the tabs on kids that they have released from detention, pretrial or even post-adjudication. And there are other counties that are doing health checks on staff coming in, temperature checks to make sure that they're not spreading it as they enter, and also making some sort of arrangement so that kids who have to remain in confinement continue to receive the quality education, treatment, or whatever programming that they were receiving prior to the crisis, so that they still maintain some sort of structure. And we also, the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, is a part of a national movement of advocates reaching out to stakeholders around the country and the state to advocate for releasing youth from justice facilities. We sent a letter to various stakeholders around the state, and we're hoping that we'll get some good responses from this outreach and engagement.
Thank you for elevating that voice, Jason. I've been avidly paying attention to this issue and haven't heard children mentioned at all, except for they've been early said to be immune, and that's not being the case. So we really want to support you in elevating that voice. So let's talk a little bit more and get to our topic. So there's two questions I want to pose. One is, first, can you talk a little bit about, as the panel, talk a little bit about why you believe having convictions set aside, whether it's by petition or by automatic, why that's important for juveniles and adults. And then second, let's talk about the package that passed the House here in Michigan and now sits in the Senate committee. So Hakeem, if you would just start us off, and I want to be also mindful of time because we're at 20 minutes after. Josh gave me a whole list of questions and we have a lot of information to share. So if we can move through those a little bit expeditiously, then I'm sure that as we get to the questions, we'll be able to expound a little bit more on some of our thinking around this issue. So Hakeem, you've been with me, with Nation Outside. We've traveled across the state. Can you give us a little bit of background on the history of how this work around Clean Slate has evolved here in Michigan?
Yeah, definitely. As you know, this is a national conversation. And here in the state of Michigan, we joined that national conversation and began talking about what can we do to strategize, to build a coalition, to actually get the conversation involving engagement with the community, the greatest stakeholder, the greatest people mostly impacted by criminal histories, to get them engaged in the discussion. And so that became our kind of our focus around December of 2018, January 2019. We formed a great coalition around the state of Michigan, vast number of partners, and pretty much we engage communities that are the actual stakeholders and the constituents of state representatives as well as state senators who will actually be voting at some point or another relative to this expansion of a bill package that could drastically change how many people will then be freed up from being able to apply for a job without that being on their background. We crisscrossed between the state to 9 major cities. We hosted open dialogue listening sessions, gathering data from community residents and people directly impacted, families, mayors of cities, city council, you name it, were there at these various listening sessions. We gathered this data and then used this data to correlate what was really happening in Michigan, what the current law is, and how we could actually be a part of actually framing some of the discussion about what the bill should look like, what should be in the bill, who should be included, who should be excluded, et cetera. After we did that, we followed back up with some community workshops, storytelling workshops to engage individuals on learning how to properly share their story, to be impactful with state representatives and stakeholders. And then we followed up again with community listening sessions by following up and re-establishing that engagement with the community to keep them involved. Ultimately, by that time, we had engaged the direct stakeholders themselves, the state representatives, state senators, prosecutor association, various other important people that was important to the discussion. And then ultimately the bill got introduced. It was sponsored, got introduced. We were there to testify in Lansing before the Senate Judiciary, the House Judiciary Committee on the bill package late last year. It ultimately moved through the Senate, through the House Judiciary Committee, got voted out, made it to the full floor of the House, and passed overwhelmingly, and it currently now sits in the Senate Judiciary Committee right now in limbo as we continue to have discussions like this to figure out how we are going to continue supporting this ultimate bill package to get passed.
Thanks. That was a lot. You summarized a year and a half's work in 3 minutes. And I also just want to recognize our coalition partners that we've had throughout this process. It was Michigan Faith in Action, Just Leadership USA, Safe and Just Michigan, Nation Outside, Detroit Justice Center, and Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. So we want to acknowledge all of our partners. John, it has been a long journey. So could you talk a little bit about where we're at now? Why is this process taking so long? And what's in the legislative package that really matters to the people?
Sure. Well, let me take a step back for a second and just sort of frame the problem we're trying to solve. So right now, there are over 2 million people in Michigan with criminal convictions that are over 5 years old. That's 20% of our state population. Those 2 million people, in many cases, are locked out of meaningful employment opportunities and locked out of good housing options because employers and landlords do criminal background checks. Those background checks do not take into account typically how old a conviction is or what a person has done since that time. So the old conviction ends up being a kind of a lifetime sentence for people. The one exception to that is if they can get their criminal records sealed. That process, as many of you know, is called expungement. And unfortunately, the current system is not working for people. Too few people are eligible. Far less than half of the people with criminal records are currently eligible for expungement. Just so that, to put it in perspective, half of all criminal cases in Michigan are traffic offenses, and no traffic offenses are currently eligible for expungement. Second, if you have more than 1 felony or 2 misdemeanors on your record, at any point during your lifetime, you're not eligible to apply for expungement under current rules. Further, the expungement process that's set up is filing a court petition. In the court you were sentenced is a process that takes 6 to 9 months for most people and involves fees and a lot of administrative steps that are burdensome for working people or people who are struggling. And only 6.5% of people who are eligible are able to navigate that process. That ends up being about 3,000 people a year. What we would like to do through the bill package that's pending is expand eligibility for expungement and solve some of the process problems that are keeping people from completing the process. And there's 5 bills that expand the eligibility requirements in various ways. And there is another bill that says after 7 years for a misdemeanor or 10 years for a felony, your record will be automatically sealed. There's limitations on how broad that bill is for people with more than 2 felony and 4 misdemeanor convictions, but it's a good first step in our view. These bills passed the House in November. We actually were hearing that they were likely to be brought up for a hearing in late March, but unfortunately the public health situation we're dealing with came up and that's no longer the case. In terms of why there has been a delay, a lot of it has to do with scheduling. The House bills are voted out in early November, but that was right before a bunch of breaks the legislature takes, both around, they call it the hunting break, is in mid-November, and that runs right into Thanksgiving. And there's a few weeks of session in December, but people are mostly thinking about the holidays. So it really wasn't realistic the bills would be brought up just due to scheduling reasons in the Senate before January. And in January and February, we were hearing questions from senators, how is this automatic process going to work? How is this going to be implemented within courts and clerks' offices? Are we going to expect costs related to that? Are the expansions of eligibility going to lead to increased numbers of petitions so that courts and clerks' offices need to hire more people? So those are all questions that, need to be addressed within the legislature before they're going to pass the law. And we've been talking to senators for the last couple months about why it's not likely to cost a lot of money. And even if it does cost something, the benefits will far outweigh the costs. And just a couple data points on that. A recent study by the University of Michigan found that for people that get their records sealed in Michigan, they see a 23% increase in income within a year and 25% within 2 years. And it's estimated that if this bill package passes, it will help about 500,000 people in the state.
Wow. That's an impact. So what about the kids, Jason? Where are we at legislatively and inclusively concerning juveniles?
So first I want to say that we are really grateful to the work that's being done on the Adult Clean Slate package. I feel like some of these questions and the answers to them to address those issues really help on the youth bills as well. And so we really have been following in that path. In fact, the bills that we are supporting, we help to work and help draft legislation with a couple of senators, Senator Irwin and Lucido, to introduce bills after the Clean Slate bills passed the House. Senate Bill 681 and 682 are the bills that we're supporting. They are, just like Adult Clean Slate, waiting for a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee. The legislation would really clean up the process for a young person seeking a set-aside of a juvenile adjudication, which even though it's not considered an adult conviction, many employers, colleges, the military, getting a professional license, having a juvenile adjudication impacts people's ability to have a successful future, transitioning to adulthood, and most don't even know that their youth record is still impacting them. And so what the bills would do, first, Senate Bill 681 would really clean up the language that for the eligibility criteria for a young person to apply to seek a set-aside or seal their juvenile record. Right now, it's really confusing. There's 3 different scenarios in which a young person could be eligible for a set-aside, and it's really the whichever is the latest of the 3, including when a child turns 18. So currently, a lot of young people who got in trouble when they were 14, 15 are not eligible to have their record sealed and apply for college and say that, no, I have not been adjudicated for any of the offense until after their 18th birthday, missing that critical period for many after they graduate high school or start their employment after they graduate high school. So it would do that. And then similar to the Adult Clean Slate package, it would set up an automatic set-aside process 2 years following court supervision, or a little bit later, once a child turns 18. But it would give a 2-pronged process, one where young people could apply, others later on down the road where they're automatically set aside. And the records aren't physically destroyed, just like on the adult side, but they're not available to the public. And what Senate Bill 682 does is makes all juvenile records, whether a young person is currently involved with the court or their case has been closed or successfully terminated, no longer available to the public. And that was the case for most of the history of the juvenile justice system. For most of our history, juvenile records were not available to the general public, and that actually changed in the late 80s and 90s during the tough on crime era, where the law changed so that anyone could have public access to a juvenile court record if they requested from the adjudicating court. And in fact, some kids' cases are actually online. If you look at a juvenile court docket, you could see many kids, depending on the county, and it varies county to county. You can see a kid's case, what time it is, what the hearing date, and so it reduces the important confidentiality that young people should have. And so far in our meetings, and again, we're still waiting for a hearing as well, but in meetings with senators, and we started to do some outreach in the House as well, the House Judiciary members and just members at large, there seems to be good support for this. Obviously, the House supported Adult Clean Slate. What we're hearing is that they want to make sure that we don't forget about kids in this situation, that young people, people who have long made amends for whatever their issues were when they were committed as a youth, particularly mostly for things that are just typical youthful behavior, it shouldn't impact their ability to get a job and get a driver's license or go to post-secondary education. And so we're hoping that we can build off of this momentum around this discussion around record confidentiality to pass good legislation to make sure that records for kids remain private and increase that protections on their confidentiality.
And just so we're clear, when a child graduates from the juvenile system, their records don't go away. Absolutely
not. And that's contrary to what most people believe. And even to a person, every senator that we met with to talk about these bills, they all said the exact same thing. Well, I thought that their records are automatically cleared when they turn 18, and that's not the case. Their records are public. Anyone can seek them out. There is no automatic expungement process. Youth have to go through, similar as adults, a convoluted process with an unclear eligibility criteria. You have to pay significant sums of money, especially if you're getting some attorney support to go through the hearing process and to get their records cleared. And so a lot of young people, either they're unaware that their record still affects them, or they don't apply, and that impacts their ability to apply for college. Some of them, when they see that question about whether or not you've been adjudicated for an offense, some of them don't even continue with the process. And in starting our advocacy for these bills, we've talked to several people. I talked to a man who committed an offense when he was 15, stayed out of trouble, is now in his 30s, and tried to get a barber's license and was unable to do so because of a juvenile adjudication. So it's something that is a real problem that needs to change.
Yeah, thank you. So we have time for a couple more questions. I'll start off with Hakeem, and John, I'll give you the last question. I want to encourage everybody, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. If we don't get to answer them today, we'll find ways to answer them in the future. Hakeem, you're an amazing ground organizer here in Michigan. What can people do to get involved to help move Clean Slate forward?
Well, you know, one of the things we've been working on just recently on our partnership with CEO as well as Detroit Justice Center is we've been having conversations with individuals that have directly impacted by the criminal justice system, and actually having conversations with them about prepping them about getting involved in the conversation. I think that the most important thing we can do for individuals right now, particularly during this particular crisis, is to encourage people to actually start getting involved, learning what's at stake, learning how things are impacting them in their lives if they have criminal histories or if they have family members that have direct criminal histories. We need to learn about the resources that are available out there, start sharing this information. We really, like, if nothing else, we need to start learning how to become more effective in our communication with each other and communicating information from and to each other during this critical crisis right now. As we move forward with Clean Slate and begin pushing for this bill to ultimately be passed, we really need to begin focusing on educating the public on how important this bill is going to change the lives of individuals that it impacts, and how we need to continue, however, building more momentum behind this to go to the next round. What's the next stage of work that we're going to be doing in which we're going to be seeking to remove barriers for individuals that are directly impacted by the criminal punishment system, and all of the massive barriers that are in play that still prevent many hundreds of thousands of people, even after these bills pass, who still need an opportunity to have access to employment and opportunity to access to housing. That urgent need still doesn't go away because we passed a very expansive bill package that's going to impact tens of thousands of people. And so I think it's important for us right now to begin engaging people in the community, because everyone is impacted. Our families are impacted. Everyone that we can know and have contact with are in some way or another impacted by these barriers that are faced by people like us that have criminal histories and are unable to move forward in life in a meaningful way, but not only in a meaningful way, importantly, in a healing way, because as we know, having a criminal history is continuously traumatizing, continuously impacts our mental health as we move through life. And if we don't get these barriers removed, that it compounds the levels of trauma that are impacting us. And so we're going to have to begin addressing this with everyone. Everyone's going to begin to have this conversation if we're going to move forward with not only healing our communities, but building stronger and safer and more vibrant communities. We have to have this conversation, and I think people right now need to begin having this conversation. So it's very commendable for nearly 100 people to be involved in this particular conversation, this dialogue. We need to continue promoting things like the Day of Empathy to push the dialogue further, to get people involved in having more conversation.
Second, that we don't want our work to go in vain. We put in too much time, too much labor, sweat, and tears to not see this happen. So, John, given that the legislature is going to come back, they're going to have challenges to deal with, given the COVID-19 crisis and other legislative issues that may wind up in the deck. How can we, as an advocacy organization and supporting the policy work that's being advanced through the lobby, how can we make sure that this doesn't wind up on the bottom of the deck? What can people do to keep this as a present and active bill in the committee?
Sure. Well, I think the most important thing is legislators need to hear from us. They need to hear from people who would be impacted by the bills and people who care about getting this done, because there is going to be a lot of competing priorities happening when the legislature comes back. We don't know exactly how long it's going to be. You know, when we heard the other week that the legislature is going to be wrapping up before their spring break, which is next week and the week after, you know, we were hearing that they'd be out for quite a bit longer than just spring break. I mean, we've got some meetings that have been rescheduled for the end of April, but it could very well creep into May before they're ready to come back and get back to work. So, you know, we're going to give folks a couple weeks to deal with the crisis, but then we're going to circle back and start putting the pressure on. And we'd encourage everybody on this call to do that as well. We at Safe and Just Michigan have a campaign page with a bunch of resources for contacting legislators, call scripts, that sort of thing. It's, I believe, on our website. The tab is A Clean Slate for Michigan. Check that out for resources, or reach out to us directly if you'd like to get involved. You know, Lansing is isolated from the population centers in the state. It's hard to get people out, you know, particularly during session, because session is in the middle of the day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and most people have to work. But, you know, if you are available to come to Lansing and want to do office visits, we can help facilitate that. Okay. So thanks in advance for the support.
Yeah, and if you're of Michigan and you are engaged in this work and interested in supporting you, we will be hearing from Hakeem, myself, and other people who are at the ground level. So we have a couple questions. We have about 5 minutes. I will put this out there. It's not necessarily a question around Clean Slate, but it is a question about people being released from prison. And so here we are, advocates. The question is, I'm a man whose life without parole sentence was commuted in December 2018, and I was released February 12, 2019. What this gentleman would like to see is a state-by-state strategy on commutations. Can we organize around this issue together? Hakeem, John, Jason, I'll leave it up to you what your thoughts are in response to that question.
So I actually appreciate this question. This relates to some other things that we're doing. But yes, I think the commutation power within the governor's office has been underused, not just in Michigan, but across the country. But, especially in Michigan, to be honest with you, because of, so 10% of our prison population is serving life without parole. Those are folks that only get out if their sentences are commuted. We have a very harsh truth in sentencing law. It's perhaps the harshest in the country. So folks aren't even eligible for parole until they get their minimum. So those are situations where the governor's office could come in and do a lot of good in terms of facilitating releases for people that should be released. And just there hasn't been a lot of activity around that. There's not dedicated resources in the governor's office. We think there should be more resources inside the parole board as well. And that there should be a much more proactive approach to commutations than is currently happening. And we and our partners will be working on advocacy around commutations, not just in connection with the COVID epidemic, but more generally because of these structural barriers to release for people.
Yeah, thanks, John. Anybody else have a thought on that?
No, I'll leave it to the experts on that. Though I support it, we definitely need to use more commutations in Michigan than we do.
Okay. Lastly, we'll end on this note. The Michigan Department of Corrections Security Classification Instrument automatically grants prisoners a 2-point reduction in terms of management. This is based on a statistical analysis showing, in part, a decline in aggressive behaviors. Do you have any thoughts on incorporating this idea into a bill calling for automatic expungement at the same age? Did that make sense?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And what I would say is that the current bill takes the social science that's behind that into account. And there's very well established evidence that people, quote unquote, age out of crime. And that's based on maturation of person's brain that reduces risk-taking behavior, impulsive behavior. So there's good evidence to support, as a general matter, automatic expungements for people as they age. And what the research the bill is based on says is that what matters more is not how many things a person has done, but how long it's been since they've been engaged in criminal activity. Because the research says that after 3 to 5 years, a person is likely out of that habit. And to put it at age 26, if someone's gotten in trouble at age 25, is something we'd have a hard time selling to legislators. But saying if a person got in trouble at age 26 and has stayed out of trouble until age 31, then we've got a lot more research to back up a policy like that. So the automatic expungement says for misdemeanors, it's 7 years, and for felonies, it's 10 years of staying out of trouble. And we advocated for shorter time periods, but that was not what the legislators were willing to do.
Okay, well, thanks, John. And I would say an example of people changing is Mr. Crampton, who's been on parole how long?
14 years.
14 years and still on parole. It doesn't make any sense. People change. So thank you all for participating in our first session of today's events. We want to acknowledge Safe and Just Michigan, Cut 50, and all of our co-sponsors for participating in today's first conversation. For the rest of you, for the remainder of the day, I would also like to say there's still time to sign up for our remaining panels throughout the day, which at 11:30 will be Pregnancy in Prison, Standards of Care. At 1 o'clock, featured speaker Oswald Thomas, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And 3 p.m., Michigan Task Force on Jail and Pretrial Incarceration. You can register at Safe and Just Michigan, or just do a search on Day of Empathy, and they'll have all the events listed for Michigan. Thanks for your time and your interest.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank our co-sponsors again, Cut 50, our national partner, AFSC Michigan Criminal Justice Program, ARROW, Citizens for Prison Reform, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, Michigan Center for Youth Justice, Michigan Faith in Action, Nation Outside, Still Standing Against Domestic Violence, the University of Michigan Carceral State Project, the University of Michigan Prison Creative Arts Project. On the screen, we've included several ways that you can keep in contact with Safe and Just Michigan. We hope all of you will use the hashtags Day of Empathy, Why Empathy, and Empathy365 on social media to engage with other people participating in the Day of Empathy all across the country. We also hope you will let us know if you enjoyed the panel. Fill out our exit survey at bit.ly/MIDOESURVEY. That's MIDOE survey. MIDOE survey. Thanks again for participating in today's panel and hope to see you on the panels throughout the day.
Thanks for inviting us into your homes.